In this video, we cover section 2.3, solve quadratic equations, part 1, math course NCBM 0314. A quadratic equation is an equation in form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This is a standard form of a quadratic equation. You see, this equation has one variable x that the greatest power of x is 2. A, b, c are real numbers. We call them constants. A cannot be 0 because 0 times x squared is going to be 0, and our equation is not anymore a quadratic equation. Before we start talking about solving quadratic equations methods, let's check two important properties. The zero product property that says if multiplication of two factors is 0, at least one of those factors must be 0. And the square root property says if a squared equals b, then a equals positive negative square root of b. I'm going to show you some examples of equations using these two properties and solving those equations. This is an example from your notebook, and question says solve this equation. You see here we have multiplication of two parentheses equal 0. So we have the zero product property. If we use that property, each of these parentheses is a factor. So x minus 2 could be 0, or x plus 4 could be 0. Here we have two linear equations. Solving these two linear equations, add 2 to both sides of this equation. X is 2. Subtract 4 from both sides of this equation. X is negative 4. You see we have two values for x. We call them solutions of this equation. So we solve this equation using the zero product property. This is another example from your notebook. Again, question asks you solve this equation. X plus 1 squared equals 16. You see one side is a parenthesis square equals a number. We can use a square root property and take a square root from both sides. The square root of x plus 1 squared is x plus 1. And on the right side, we have positive negative square root of 16. We know a square root of 16 is 4. So we have this new equation. What does it mean, this new equation? So that means we have two simple linear equations. One of them x plus 1 equals 4. The other one x plus 1 equals negative 4. I can solve both these two equations. Subtract 1 from both sides, so x equals 3 for the first equation. Subtract 1 from both sides of the second equation. X is negative 5. That means we have two solutions for this equation. So we learned how we can use a square root property to solve an equation. Let's go back to a standard form of a quadratic equation. First example, you see a quadratic equation that a, b, c are non-zero. You see a here is 2, b coefficient of x is -5, c equals 3. The second equation, a coefficient of x squared is 6, b coefficient of x is 2, but there is no constant, that means c equals 0. The last one, a coefficient of x squared is 2, but there is no x, that means b equals 0, and c constant -6. Please note that we can solve these equations in different methods. Let's talk about example number 2 and 3 and how we can solve these types of quadratic equations when we have only two terms. Here a and b are non-zero, c is 0. Here a and c are non-zero and b is 0. If we have our equation, quadratic equation in this form, means a and b are non-zero and c is 0, the best way to solve this quadratic equation is factoring. So we factor 2x from both terms. So it's going to be 2x times 3x plus 1 equals 0. We factor left side of this equation. Now, multiplication of 2x and 3x plus 1 is 0. Using the zero product property, 2x could be 0 or 3x plus 1 is 0. Now we solve these two linear equations. 2 times x is 0. 2 cannot be 0, so x is 0. This is one solution. And solving this linear equation, subtract 1 from both sides. 3x equals to -1. If I divide both sides by 3, x equals -1 over 3. So you see in this form, I have two solutions, 0 and -1 over 3. Now let's solve this example. A and c are non-zero, b is 0. We can solve these types of quadratic equations in different forms. One form is factoring. The other form, you can solve this equation like linear equation. That means you add 6 to both sides. 2x squared equals 6. Now divide both sides by 2. X squared equals 3. You remember, if we have an equation, one side power 2 and the other side a number, we can use a square root property. So if I use a square root property, take a square root from both sides, x equals positive negative square root of 3. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 3 is a square root of 3 positive negative. Now that means x could be a square root of 3 or x could be negative square root of 3. Again, we have two solutions, two real solutions for this equation. Please note this type of equations sometimes don't have any real solutions. Now, if I have a complete quadratic equation in a standard form, how can I solve that equation? We have different methods First one is factoring. We will cover it in this section. And the other three methods completing this were quadratic formula and graphing that we will cover it in next video, section 2.4. Let's go check factoring. Solve quadratic equation by factoring is very easy if you know how to factor an expression, a quadratic or trinomial expression. If you want to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, you should follow these first three steps. First, write your equation in standard form. Then factor left side of that quadratic equation, and last, use the zero product property to find solutions. Step 4 is just to check your solutions. Let's solve this equation by factoring. Step 1, we need to have our equation in a standard form that already we have it in a standard form. Step 2, we need to factor left side of this equation. You remember how to factor x squared plus 5x plus 6. We write this expression as multiplication of two parentheses, x as the first term inside of both parentheses. Now we are looking for two numbers that if we add them would be b, means coefficient of x. If we multiply them, should be equals to c, means 6. So those two numbers are 2 and 3. If we add 2 and 3, it's going to be 5. If you multiply them, you will have 6. So this means I factor x squared plus 5x plus 6. This is factoring of this expression. Now, in this equation, instead of x squared plus 5x plus 6, I can write x plus 2 times x plus 3 equals 0. We use the zero product property to solve this equation. That means x plus 2 equals 0 or x plus 3 equals 0. Solving these two linear equations, one solution is negative 2 and the other solution is negative 3. So you see that we can solve a quadratic equation in a standard form by factoring. Let's check another example. This example, you see A is 2. To solve this quadratic equation by factoring, first I'm going to factor left side. If you remember one of the methods to factor this quadratic expression, because A means coefficient of x squared is not 1, so one of the methods says we can multiply all terms by this coefficient and rewrite it as 2x squared minus 3 times 2x plus 1 times 2 is 2, divide by 2. Now 2x is our new variable, so I can write top of this fraction as multiplication of two parentheses, 2x as the first term. Then I'm looking for two numbers that if I add them, I will get negative 3. If I multiply them, get 2. Those two numbers are negative 2 and negative 1. Now if you factor 2 from the first parenthesis, you can cancel that 2 the denominator. So what's left? X minus 1 times 2x minus 1. So we factor this expression. So instead in this equation, instead of 2x squared minus 3x plus 1, on the left side you can write it x minus 1 times 2x minus 1. So you see here, instead of 2x squared minus 3x plus 1 equal to 0, I rewrite it as a factoring form, x minus 1 times 2x minus 1 equal to 0. Now if I use the 0 product property, x minus 1 is 0 or 2x minus 1 is 0. Solving these two linear equations, one solution is 1. If I solve the second equation, 2x equals 1 divided by 2 both sides. The second solution is 1 over 2. So we solve this equation by factoring and we have two solutions, x equals 1 and x equals 1 over 2. Now you should be able to solve any quadratic equation that you are able to factor by factoring method. This is the end of this video. We will cover other methods to solve a quadratic equation in a standard form in section 2.4.